Now we can get started. Now you're here. How are you all doing?
Doing good. What about you?
Good, thank you.
All right. Well, let's dive in. I'm going to share this, which actually goes with what we did the last time. I sent it to you all, not near as soon as I intended to, but I finally got it together. When we were talking about the books that were in and out and questioned and doubted about what belongs in the New Testament, here's a little chart that's about the most concise thing that I've seen. So you have all of these characters across the top. These are all people. This is a list. This is an actual early document. And then you have this codex at Sinai, which is an almost complete Greek Bible. And then you have the Syriac Bible, the Peshitta here. And then you have the Alexandrian manuscript, which again is almost a complete Bible and has every sign of showing that it was a complete Bible. It's just lost pages. Whole codex in book form. This one they date somewhere in the late 5th century, 425 to 475. This one they date a little bit earlier, maybe as late as the 350, or as early as 350, I should say. And then what you have are these codes to tell you whether this book is included in this copy or this person's list, whether it's missing, whether it's omitted, and omitted is different from missing in terms of it's just not ever was there. There's no sign that it was ever in that list. And then you get a few people who remark about it such that they might dispute it or reject it. And there's just a couple of those because there weren't many who made lists that went into that kind of detail. They just gave you a list of theirs. But this gives you a little bit of clue to see, especially those books that aren't. And the few times they show up. They're omitted from this list. These three are, openly rejected by the person. In most cases, they're just not there. There's no reference to them, pro or con. They're just not there. And I've got a copy that you all can have. Just a quick little reference, mainly with these down here to let you see. And then a few of these up here, you see, where there were some that were questioned and some that are missing, even from the manuscript. Okay, any question about that? We'll close it and get it out of our way. Most of the time tonight, we wanted to spend on the manuscripts, and I just now realized I failed to open one of the documents that I wanted to show. So let me right quick see if I can find it. Well, I know it's in this one. Ancient versions. Now let me get it up when they can see this. Get rid of that one, get rid of this. and go back to share this. Before we look at the manuscripts, we need to take just a minute to notice that in understanding the manuscripts, early copies we have of the Bible, you have to understand the issue of not the manuscripts, but the versions. Now, actually, many of these versions are in manuscript form early. The term manuscript is used in this study of the Bible to apply only to the handwritten copies. That's a manuscript. And when it stands by itself, you just talk about the manuscripts of the New Testament or the Old Testament. Usually what you're referring to are the manuscripts in the original language. So a manuscript of the Old Testament would be in Hebrew, with the exception of those passages in Aramaic. Manuscripts of the New Testament would be in Greek. But in terms of copies that we have, some of the oldest copies we have of various parts of the Bible are not in Hebrew or Greek, because both the Old Testament and the New Testament was translated and is considered an alternative version. And as I just mentioned, the oldest ones of these, prior to the printing in the 16th century, would all be manuscripts too, because they'd all be handwritten. The first one on the list here is the Samaritan version, which is technically not a version because it's not a translation. It's in Hebrew. It's not written in the Hebrew that the Jews were using in Jesus' days. It's written in an older Hebrew script, but it's Genesis through Deuteronomy plus Joshua. And it's virtually the same thing as we have in the Pentateuch plus the first book of the prophets of Joshua. It didn't become a part of Christian awareness until the 17th century, although Jerome, in his discussions about his translation work, seems to have known, maybe even seen, a Greek translation of this version. And so even though it's in Hebrew, it's not identical to the Hebrew versions, Hebrew manuscripts that we have, even the oldest ones. It shows a slightly different text, which is one of the issues that we look at. One of the features is that it sometimes agrees with the Greek translation we're going to look at next, and sometimes it doesn't. One of the interesting places this shows up, there's a study that's been made by a man, that the Samaritan version shows up in Stephen's translation, Stephen's defense in Acts 7. There's 2 or 3 verses there where he quotes an Old Testament passage. And the way it's recorded in the Greek doesn't agree with the Septuagint or the Hebrew, but it does agree with this Samaritan version that we now know about, which led the guy who did this study to conclude that Philip was probably a Samaritan. And in fact, he argues that the whole argument there between the people about their widows was an argument between 2 minorities, was an argument between the Samaritan Christians and the Greek Christians. Okay, the Septuagint is a common used word, and what is ordinarily considered the, quote, Septuagint version is what we find in these 2 old copies of the Bible. The one in Sinai, the one in Alexandria, and then there's a third one in the Vatican. And these are fourth century. What we now know is that beginning in the fourth century, 300s, the Hebrew Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, was being translated into Greek. It wasn't all done at the same time. It wasn't all done the same way. There are significant variations from book to book, and even within the same book. There's striking differences in a few cases. The version of Jeremiah that survives is much shorter than the Hebrew. There are whole passages that they didn't translate, apparently. Because the Christians adopted it and quoted from it, and things like Isaiah 7:14 for the virgin birth was a thing they didn't like, the Jews in Jesus' day made several revisions, new translations of the Old Testament books into Greek, and those have only survived in scraps. And we know they were there because there are discussions about them, but we don't have any real good solid pieces of it. This man Origen in the 3rd century compiled this 6-volume Bible for the Old Testament. He had the Hebrew, and then his transliteration, letter by letter transfer from Hebrew into Greek. And then he had 2 of these late translations, one by a man by the name of Aquila, one by a man by the name of Symmachus. Then he had what he considered the older Greek version, probably from the 3rd century. And then Theodotion was a third one of these modern ones. So he knew of 4 Greek translations of books of the Old Testament. By Jesus' time, significant number of Jews, the majority, in fact, of Jews, had been living in an Aramaic environment for 400 or 500 years. And so they increasingly spoke Aramaic, not Hebrew. Now, they're kin languages, but there are grammatical differences, and they use different words they use the same word with different meanings in some cases, a lot of commonality, but there are striking differences. And because of this, a lot of ordinary people would not understand the reading of Scripture in Hebrew. They wouldn't know what that meant. And so the Jews had developed the tradition by Jesus' day that when the text was read in Hebrew in the synagogue, it was followed in some manner, verse by verse translation or the whole paragraph, and then it would be repeated in Aramaic. But because of the oral law tradition that we've mentioned, they didn't tend to write these down. It was a free thing that was done in the synagogue. So that these Targumim, which is simply the plural of Targum, while there were verbal translations, and they were probably fairly regulated and fairly common, but because they weren't written, whoever translated in the synagogue was somewhat free to translate how he wanted to. So when these started being written down, they're not real close to the time of Jesus. And since they come with this long-standing oral tradition, you really have a problem with, well, what Hebrew text lies behind this Aramaic translation? Is he paraphrasing? Is this Taylor reading to his kids, or Phillips translating for his post-war World War II teenagers? But there's interesting information in these. The long-standing official ones that develop in Babylon, which a couple of hundred years after Jesus' time becomes the center of Judaism. And Orthodox Judaism grows out of that Babylonian Judaism. And only in the last century or so have we found the counterparts to all of these things that were done in Palestine. And now we have them. This last one here, the Neophiti, which is the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, in Aramaic, a copy of it was recognized in the Vatican back in the days when I was in graduate school. And the guy who recognized it was a Spaniard. And so my professor in Aramaic immediately took the summer off so he could learn Spanish, so he could read all this guy's stuff that he originally wrote. And he didn't have to wait for somebody to translate it for him because he wanted to be on top of it. So you have 2 versions of these Targumim, one that originates in Israel and one that originates in Babylon. Then Christianity came very early to Babylon, to the Mesopotamian Valley, and there they spoke Aramaic. And so you shouldn't be surprised that very early they started translating both the New Testament, especially, and then the Old Testament, writing it down in Aramaic. And it's called Syriac, but Syriac is just a different written form of the Aramaic language. It's a new written alphabet, that's all. It's much more script flowing than traditional Aramaic was. What you see in most cases as Hebrew letters are really Aramaic letters. The Hebrews, the Jews adopted the Aramaic alphabet forms. And so what you see as Hebrew is really Aramaic in its old version. Syriac is its new version.
Well, and this is probably a dumb question, but is Aramaic still spoken?
Yes, yeah. There are still pockets of ethnic groups in the Middle East that spoke Aramaic. We'll get to it when we get to it. There's a fellow who immigrated from that part of the country to the United States, and he translates into English this Aramaic version of the Bible. And with some claims that it may be superior to the Hebrew text that the English translators have used. But you got to remember, you see, that Aramaic does like every other language, and in 2,000 years it changes significantly too. And so,
the Hebrew too?
Pardon?
Does the Hebrew language change too?
Oh yeah.
Well, then Aramaic was first, wasn't it? I mean,
No.
at the same time.
Yeah. They were kindred language.
So they're probably.
And then Christianity very, very early moved into the Roman world. I mean, Paul is writing before he gets there, and there are already Christians in Rome. He meets Aquila and Priscilla, who are Jewish Christians who were thrown out of Rome years before that. So Christianity was there. And North Africa was a strong Roman Latin community, group of communities, cities. Carthage in Jesus' day was Latin. And so very early, the Bible was translated into Latin. And it was done just like the Greek version had been done 300-400 years before. It was done by various people who had this copy or that copy, this book or that book, and they translated it into Latin. So by Jerome's day, in the 4th century, there were versions all over the place. It was as bad as the modern situation in English with all these translations. Well, golly, which one am I supposed to use? And so Augustine and eventually the Pope encouraged Jerome to make a revision of one of these at least. Well, after he worked for it a while, Jerome gave up on it and he just made his own new translation. And instead of translating the Greek Bible, which was around in the Greek world, he went to Palestine and learned Hebrew so he could translate the Old Testament from the Hebrew texts that he could get and translate the New Testament from the New Testament texts that he could get.
That's
And-
like in Catholicism, I've heard that they sort of break off into 2 parts. Like you have the Romans, like Catholics, which is the Latin, but then you have another group of Catholics that they're still Catholics, don't get me wrong, but they're not really so much into the Latin part of it, and they actually divide themselves into 2 categories. The Catholic Church.
I don't think there's that, I'm not aware that there's that kind of simple division.
It might not be simple, but
There-
there's a division in consciousness to different things. You're either like a Latin Catholic.
There are,
Or there's another.
no, well, there arose in Vatican II a significant number of churches, Catholic churches, who rejected Vatican II's call for the Mass to be said in the vernacular.
Right.
And so you have these Latin Catholic churches that still have their whole liturgies in Latin.
But they also even go to where the Latin priests can't marry. But in another sect, or whatever you want to call it, in the church, they can't.
There's not a significant group of Catholics that allow the priest to marry. That's one thing that they didn't let go of very well.
But they're doing it.
No, that there's not any significant Catholic movement that allows the priests to marry. There have been a few Catholic priests, a few Catholics who were married, who have been allowed to become priests and keep their wife. But I'm not.
Are you talking about the same thing? Yeah, we're talking about. Okay, but you're talking about. But I'm saying you can't be married, not be married a couple, but the priest.
No, she's being married. And I'm not aware of any significant sector within the Catholic Church that has opened the priesthood to being married.
Look it up.
I'll have to check that, but I'm not aware that's there.
Okay.
Because the English side of it, the last 25 years has been trying hard to push it, and they've not gotten anywhere. This Jerome's version becomes the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church. The common language, vulgar, is Latin for common. In addition to those, remember in Jesus' day, the Greeks ruled Egypt. The aristocracy, the official operation was all done by the Greeks. But you had the native Egyptians still there. And they spoke Coptic language. And so when they became Christians, they began to translate their stuff. And we know of some as early as the latter part of the 3rd century. And so now in the 3rd and 4th century, we have versions of Coptic Bibles that are as old as the Greek Bibles that we have intact as Bibles. Remember, early Christianity went to Ethiopia, and they developed entirely separate from the from the Mediterranean arena. And so they early have a translation. Progress of Christianity into Eastern Europe produces a Gothic version in the 4th century and an Armenian version in the 5th century. In these cases, they not only had to write it down, they had to invent an alphabet to write it. The Armenian translation seems to have been translated from the Syriac version, not from the Greek. And then there's even a Gregorian version. And we have copies of all of these. And so when we have a verse that has Greek differences, some manuscripts say one thing and some manuscripts say it's slightly different, then one place to look and see, well, which one of these is the original one and which one is the modification. You might get some help from one of these versions. And obviously, if they're very paraphrastically done, then you can't really be sure what lies behind that in terms of many issues, but sometimes you can tell. And that's why these versions are introduced here. And again, you see, clear up to the 16th century, these are all manuscripts. And they're a source for us to look at. Okay. Nope. Okay. All right. No, I don't want to end this, do I? Let's see here. Let's do it this way. I'm going to bring this up just to give you a sketchy introduction of the Old Testament. And I've got another, oh, here it is too. The Jewish tradition, remember the discussion that's often referred to as when they established their canon at the Jamnia conference or Yavna, and they discuss various books. They indicate that there's this special literature that makes the hands unclean. So they take a very high view of the written scrolls. And the Jews to this day still operate with manuscripts in the synagogue. Scripture is read from a scroll, handwritten scroll. So we have scrolls, old scrolls, but when a scroll got too old to be used, it got deconsecrated and destroyed. And so we have almost no manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible until about 1,000. And then we don't have but a couple at that stage, and there's a couple more 100 years before then we begin to have some that were saved, that they weren't bad enough that they burned them or however it is they wanted to take care of them. The two that we have are this Aleppo and Leningrad ones. They're mentioned in the textbook. And then there are a couple more that arise. Now, the value of these old manuscripts was significantly enhanced when in the 70s, we discovered in those Judean desert caves around the Dead Sea, the Qumran community and other places, we found two nearly intact scrolls of Isaiah. And we'll look at those when we look at the issue of variants in the Old Testament. There have been a few others discovered. There was a synagogue in Cairo where the scrolls didn't get destroyed. They got put in a room pursuant to that. And somehow that room got covered over and nobody realized it was there. And so when it was finally opened centuries later, here are a couple of documents. Unfortunately, there wasn't a large collection of scrolls there. There were a number of other Hebrew documents that turned out to be very helpful. Here's a little sketch of a timeline that's involved in terms of oldest material we have for looking at the Old Testament. There's this one little scrap. There's the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have found in the Dead Sea Scrolls at least a scrap of every book of the Old Testament but Esther. Now, we haven't come anywhere close to getting a complete one, but we have found a lot of them, a lot of pieces. And among them, we've now been able to determine that some of the translations that were made into the Greek were clearly made from a different version of the Hebrew text than the Jews preserved in their heritage of texts. They were very exacting in how they copied their texts. And the Greek translation doesn't read. There's no way you could get that Greek translation out of the Hebrew text as it now reads. So there's always been the suspicion that this isn't just some made up free translation. They were actually reading a different Hebrew text. Well, examples of that were found at Qumran. They verified that theory. Then you have the Peshitta, and then finally the Vulgate. And then the Hebrew texts, after 1,000, when you get to 1,200 or so, now we have a bunch. But there are enough of the minor little differences that all the scholarly work now is done on the basis of these two. One set of scholars developed, the Leningrad was the gold standard for years because the Aleppo disappeared for a long time. It's reappeared, and now there's a group that's working on giving us a printed version of that. It lacks, in both cases, there's some pages that are missing, but it'll be a much more thorough thing than we've had in a long time. That's the Old Testament. Okay, New Testament. And I've got a copy of this to give you. This reiterates what I mentioned a while ago about the use of the terminology. Most of the New Testament manuscripts are on a skin, either parchment or vellum. There's a technical difference between those, but you frequently find them interchangeably used. We have a few on papyrus. In fact, I think I even had, let me see if I can find it here right quick. Can I do a share without, no, I can't do it. I'll come back to it in a little bit. The Greek manuscripts that we have, the earliest ones, the oldest ones, are all written in the large Greek letters, what we call capital letters now. And they're written with no punctuation and no separation of words. You just have a string of letters. And that's possible, remember, because like we discussed with the Old Testament, first writings of those materials were not for you to learn about that from the written material. The things were written down to help this person who already knew it to tell it. So once you knew what was there, you didn't have any problem reading it. I practiced that for a while in Hebrew and never could really do it very well. But that's because partly I didn't know the Hebrew words that well either. You've probably seen on internet somebody do that in English, and they'll write a sentence out and they'll leave out some of the letters. They'll jam the words all together, and they'll even leave out some of the letters, and you immediately can read it. Especially if it's a common phrase and you recognize immediately what it is. You don't even realize there's letters missing or something, you know. In the 9th century, they began to use a more flowing Greek form. They began to separate the words, they put in punctuation, and then of course, they did all kinds of elaborate artistic stuff in some of them. The numbers here are fairly stable, although there's new stuff being found all the time. Once they started using the cursive form, it was not uncommon for somebody to still follow the uncial form for one reason or another. And so you find a few uncials that are more recent than some of the cursives, but the person just wanted to do that. This gives you an idea of the uncials, all of which occurred mostly before the 10th century. There's stories about these in the book. What's our time factor? Okay. These are the major uncials. The Sinai version, there's a great story about this being found. Sneak pieces of it sneaked out, all kinds of fancy negotiations to get it released. And it's that Sinai version that we mentioned before, which also happens to have the letter of Barnabas and the shepherd of Hermas in it. It seems to have been, quote, corrected in some places by a later copyist. You can ignore this for a minute. The manuscripts, as they have studied these manuscripts, they have begun to notice that certain patterns emerge in the manuscript as to the number of times they spell a word one way versus the number of times it's spelled a different way. And remember, Greek declines all their nouns and their adjectives and conjugates all their verbs. So you have singulars and plurals and first persons and second persons and third persons and masculines and feminines. You have all kinds of grammatical things going on. The Greek language was very good at doing what we often do, turning verbs into nouns. Walking is fun. Well, walking is a verb, but when in that sentence, walking is the subject. It's a noun. Well, the Greeks did the same thing.
Gerunds.
Pardon?
Gerunds.
Say it again.
In grammar, they call that a gerund.
Yes. And they also have the form that we have in English, we call with the to run is fun, and the infinitive. In the olden days in English, we used to learn those terms and we did those kind of things. But you'll notice there's a whole lot of places today where that's not being done. The very common one is we don't use the gerund verb as a noun and give it a possessive pronoun anymore. We give it an objective pronoun. It's him coming, her coming, was this way, that way. Her walking in the door was breathtaking, is the way it should be said. Because the noun, the verb is being used as a noun, which should be modified by an adjective. But we don't say that anymore. Even the news people don't say it anymore. It's him coming, him drawing, him saying, him doing. And that's, we just don't do that. Okay. So anyway, on the basis of these patterns that they found, they've tried to group all the manuscripts that we found into clusters. And they chose clusters around the great intellectual centers of the Mediterranean world, Alexandria and Caesarea, and then somewhere to the west. And so you have this Western group and this Alexandrian group and the Caesarean group, and then there's one other. There's all kinds of technicalities, and there's a great deal of discussion, and a whole lot of people don't buy into this. The guys that do it are still discussing this. This is working theory. And so there are a lot of manuscripts that just don't fit, because part of the book has the patterns of this group, but the rest of the book has the patterns of this group. And for those people who work with this, they're fairly easily to see little patterns. The copy that has been found in the Vatican from the 4th century, the Vatican, is missing some parts. They're listed here. Here's the way it was written. And there are many modern scholars who highly prize this copy. And so it has preference for them. They have preference for it over its reading as opposed to somebody else's. Now that becomes important in the English translation because the Vatican wasn't known when the King James was translated. And so there are a number of verses where the Vatican version and those other manuscripts people associate with it based on these patterns don't match up with apparently the version that was being used for the King James translators. And then the Alexandrian, which is the third great manuscript. Parts are missing from it. And then you have these interesting additions to the text. In the Psalms, Athanasius was one of the great church leaders in the argument over the doctrine of the Trinity. Eusebius is the great historian in the 5th century of the church. And this text, this quote Bible, has notes from them,
Brother Platt, can I ask a
Yes.
quick question? So these differences that we're seeing, because you said that the manuscripts are copies, right? Handwritten copies, right?
Yes. Yes.
So these differences that we're seeing, like the other night when we were studying Acts of the Apostles and we were reading Acts 8, we were talking about the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch. And
Yes,
then
ma'am.
there's that verse, I think verse 37
Yes.
says that it was added in there,
Yes.
but in the original manuscript.
Yes.
So my question is, if they were copying and you're supposed to take okay.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to make my question. My question is, are there some copies where people are just writing down maybe what they heard and remembered, and that's why parts are missing? Are there different? Because if you're using a written
The problem
copy,
is much more complex than that, and we're going to talk about it.
Okay,
So
all right.
just hang out on the hook. We're going to get to it. That's one of the verses that we're going to
Okay.
talk about specifically even.
Oh,
Okay?
great. Okay, sorry. Okay.
No problem. Absolutely. The fourth great one of the uncials is the Ephraim. And the fascinating thing about it is, and this is interesting in terms of Bible text, it's called a palimpsest, which is simply fancy Greek for was written twice. The Bible text was scratched off the page so the page could be used to copy these 12th century works of Ephraim the Syrian, who was a great Christian leader of the Eastern Church. So they took a Bible and erased it so they could have the paper to write something else on, which is an interesting question about how you understand the Bible. And you see, now contrast that with the Jews, who were very, very meticulous about making sure that a scroll didn't get misused in any way, shape, or form. Visa is another 5th century one, and it's valuable because it's bilingual. On the left side, there is Greek. On the right side, there is Latin. It only has the Gospels and Acts. Clarimontus. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I'm not expecting you to remember to use them. I sent you the material for this, and I'll hand it out here for those that are here. This is the only one that's in the States at the Smithsonian. It has Paul's letters, 1 Corinthians through Hebrews. And it seems to be mixed, because in some places it seems to be this group, and in other places it seems to be that group. Then you have all these cursives, manuscripts by the thousands now, from the 9th to the 16th century when we started printing. There's been developments in this whole classification process and how we designate it. Currently, these are all being numbered, classified somewhat. I just mentioned a few of them here. When you get this copy, when you take a look at this, you'll see some of these. We're going to talk about this passage here. This is one of the manuscripts that puts the story of the woman taken in adultery. It's not in the book of John, it's in the book of Luke. And then there's a whole chapter, I think, in the textbook about the discovery of the papyri, which are not vellum manuscripts or leather manuscripts, which with the Hebrews, of course. These are paper for all practical purposes. And their discovery is revolutionary because they begin to be found in great masses of scrap material that finally let the scholars figure out that the Greek that the Bible is written in was a commonly used Greek form, grammar, vocabulary, and so forth. And that's why it's different from the Greek we had known from the classics. It doesn't read like the classical Greek. And prior to these discoveries, there were those who even called the Greek of the New Testament Holy Ghost Greek, as though the Holy Spirit had inspired a special Greek. Now we know this is a common. And it's these papyri that give us the oldest scrap of New Testament. the book of John. There's a little piece. Let me step out of here. I think I even found a copy of that. Let me see if I can show it to you. Here it is. Nope, sorry. Oh, maybe it's here. Yeah. Is this showing up for them? For you, it is. I'm wondering if it's showing up for them.
I can see it.
You can see it?
I can see
Yes,
it as well.
This is just a scrap of paper. And this is in a case. That's what this border is about. And this is one scrap of the book of John. And there's a whole lot of stuff we find like that. And that's the kind of thing we find at Qumran. Just like that. Okay. Let me get back to where we were. And here's just random symptoms of some of the more interesting ones. And again, this is only mentioned the ostraca, which is a scrap of pottery, because there happens to be a passage of Luke that's on one. Then we have some other Greek manuscripts that aren't, quote, Bibles. The Greek church, the Eastern church particularly, produced books eventually, and before that, pages, on vellum or papyri, of readings of the Bible to be read in church, and to be read every day between church. And they kept these lectionaries, and in many cases, they didn't worry about having a Bible because they had all of the Gospels and the book of Acts in the lectionary. You couldn't, it wouldn't be easy to find Acts 2:38 in it because you weren't sure when that passage got read in the calendar. And so the order, it's like trying to read the book of Psalms in one of these chronological Bibles, where they put the text together and what they see as a chronological order. And so you never know where the Psalm's going to show up in the text. But it's all there. The whole book of Matthew, eventually, one day or another, every verse in the book of Matthew is read. And so it's there in this lectionary. And every verse in the book of Mark and Luke and John and Acts, they're all there. So there again, you have a very early source that you could check with. Well, now we've got two Greek manuscripts here that are different. Wonder which one, well, do we have a lectionary that predates either one of them? And then you have all of these early Christian leaders who wrote. And I saw something the other day, somebody was making the claim that you could find every verse of the New Testament but 11 in the writings of these church fathers of the first 3 centuries. Again, you wouldn't have the order necessarily, but theoretically you could comb through, and this is material that survived. We've got copies of this. This has all even been translated. So you can go down the library and read all the writings of these church fathers. I even got a collection several years ago of excerpts in commentary portion, where the quotes from them are compiled according to the biblical text. And then we have all these early translations that we talked about. Now, all of these manuscripts were created by copying. Most of the time, this copying was done from written copy to written copy. Occasionally, they went mass production, and they would have a dozen or more writers, and someone would read the text, and they would write it down. And now, while one guy reads, you get 12 copies. Now, you all are familiar with homonyms, words that sound the same but are entirely different words. Words that sound pretty close but aren't quite the same. You start conjugating these verbs and declining these nouns in every instance. And it would be easy for somebody to hear something slightly differently than what the guy that was looking at it was seeing. And so you could get a version, well-intentioned, no expectation that he wasn't going to write down exactly what you were reading, but it wouldn't come out quite the same. When you're copying from one page to another page, you also have a very common problem. If you have lines that end the same or begin the same. And so you start at the first line that begins with 3 or 4 words, and you write those down, and you come back to get the rest of the line. And instead of looking at the line you took those words from, you catch the line 3 lines, 4 lines below that start with the same words. And now you've missed the whole paragraph. Or you go down and you write the text when you get to the second line, and you get halfway through and you have to look back at it to get the rest of the word. And you don't look at the second line that start with those words. You look at the first line, and now you write twice the intervening times. Now, if you knew Greek, so you were reading this and understanding it, you might catch either one of those mistakes. If you're in a hurry, you still might not catch it. But if you didn't even know Greek, you were just copying what you saw. You wouldn't even realize you'd made a mistake, because you don't know what you're saying. You don't know what you're writing. All you know is you're writing a bunch of letters. And on the uncials, remember, it's just one string of letters. If the letters at the end come out the same, the letters at the beginning the same, well, you must have done all right. So it's easy to make a mistake. Now you add to this the fact, now that you've got all these declining of nouns and conjugating of verbs, and there are literally pages. Those of you that know Spanish know that. In English, we don't do a lot of that. But, we still have the plurals and the singulars. We still have the subjunctive forms and, some of that kind of stuff. But in these languages, there are half a dozen different conjugations of a verb. Different, where there's a whole series, first persons and plurals and singulars, and that's duplicated in several different forms, what we would call in English moods, for instance. Tenses. You have 3, 4 tenses, and you've got all these various forms in each tense. So we're talking about pages of conjugations, some of which are spelled identically, but they carry a significantly different meaning. So now somebody who's reading Greek and knows what he's reading reads the sentence and then he reproduces it. But what if in the process he knows Greek 100 years later and they've changed the way they say this in Greek? And so he writes it the way it's then said in Greek, not the way it was said in Greek. And it's a minor little change, you know, it's a letter. And that's all. What do you do once the man who knows the Bible, has read the Bible numerous times, has copied the Bible numerous times? He starts in this verse, Jesus said, and it's the Sermon on the Mount. But he's in the book of Luke. Is there any possibility that he's going to write this down the way it's reported in Matthew, not the way it's reported in Luke? Paul says the same thing many times in various books, but he doesn't always say it exactly the same way. When you write it down in one passage and you come to when he says it the next time, is there any possibility you'll remember it, even though you just looked at the text, you'll still remember it the way he said it in the other book? And so now you'll write it down this way. Take the very common, simple illustration. Do you say Jesus Christ or Christ Jesus? Now I don't know how many 100 variations there might be that when they talk about all the variations in the copies of the Bible, I have no idea how many of those are simply a matter of, well, in this verse, in this manuscript, it's written in this verse, Christ Jesus, and in that manuscript, it's written Jesus Christ. But that counts as a variation. There's, you know, what are the chances that that would happen when you're talking about as much material as you have there? And there are all kinds of issues in spellings that are the same way. You all don't have the spelling problem that I do. Is this an I or an E? Or even an A. Common ordinary words.
You don't know your vowels.
No, I don't hear my vowels. It's my problem. My problem is I don't hear my vowels.
Oh,
okay. And so, you know, is this a pen or a pen? Is this get or get? And there are all kinds of subtle things in language, that one I just mentioned, where the gerund gets changed. And this is in my lifetime. This is in my adult lifetime. 35 years ago, I taught English. And it hadn't happened yet. We were still trying to help people recognize how to properly use a gerund with the possessives. That obviously isn't being done now, because that's not the way people write and talk. And that's just in my adult lifetime. Well, we're talking about copying Greek New Testaments for nearly 1,500 years. Greek changes, the same way. And so now you've got people who are copying the Bible, who now even have the temptation to correct the Bible. Because the grammar's wrong, the spelling's wrong, the order of the sentence is wrong, whatever the stylistic issue could be. And he reads it and he knows what he read, but now he gets to copy it. And how much of that might he do consciously, intentionally? How much of it might he do unconsciously? He doesn't even realize he's done it. It doesn't even register with him that he corrected the text.
Do you think they would do that because of the audience, the people that are reading it today would prefer it corrected?
I don't know.
I mean, I was just thinking that, I think that's what it's getting to anyway. Starting words. And
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah.
You know,
And then you get to some of the subtle things where it's possible that a Hebrew word is not a word at all. It's an acronym. The original writer knew that. Long time people knew that, but eventually got lost. And so it's inevitable that even with the greatest care, there's going to be some differences that slip in copy by copy by copy, which you see leads people then to say, well, if you're copying a copy and you copy the copy, well, if you make a little mistake on this key and you make a copy to another key and you make a little mistake on it, in about 4 copies, you're going to have a key that won't work. Well, sure, you're going to have a manuscript that's got mistakes in it. But the reality is, you see, we now have a bunch of manuscripts. We're not stuck with the one key, 5 keys removed from the original, the only one to unlock this door with. We've got all the intervening keys. We've got 100 intervening keys to try on that lock. And that's the value of this vast number of manuscripts. The vast number creates a much, much larger number of variants, of variations. But it also gives us a vast number of copies to work with, so that you can't say, well, you can't trust what you have, because you can verify it. You can see that this copy that you're now using is in no substantial way different from the copy of the 4th century. There's not a single solitary doctrine, not a single solitary teaching, not a single solitary person, story, event that's left out, that's materially changed in any way at all by all of these differences, because you've got numerous cross checks in every single case. And thus, the passage that you mentioned in Acts, there's no real problem of being able to say, sure, we have 500 manuscripts with this in it, but all those manuscripts come from the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th century. And we've got 500 manuscripts in the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th century, and they don't have that verse in. None of them have that verse in. Now, we don't know when it started showing up in these 500 that we've got, but we've got 500 that precede it in date that don't have it. So we can pretty firmly assume that that got added by somebody somewhere. And when you then consider the internal evidence of what that verse says, it's easy to see why it would be there. The man says, here's water, why can't I be baptized? Well, do you believe? Do you believe properly? Do you believe sincerely? Are you prepared to make all the changes that are involved in becoming a Christian? And see, those issues became of such an importance that by the 2nd and the 3rd century, there were many Christian churches that would not allow you to become a Christian until after you had been a disciple for 2 years of careful mentorship. If you weren't going to be serious and didn't demonstrate that you really were serious and could follow through with it, you didn't get to become a Christian. And so for Philip to say to this stranger, I want to be baptized, to say, well, oh yeah, let's go, would just be unthinkable to people in that context. And so that somebody suggested, and maybe it didn't start out in the text, maybe he didn't put it in the text, he put it in the margin. Maybe he put it in as a question and it got changed a little bit to where the form it is now. And then finally, somebody saw it in the margin and thought, oh, this was they missed this, and so I better stick it back in. As we're going to see when we get to this issue, that doesn't happen very often. In a couple of classes, we're going to go through the entire New Testament. And we're going to look at every single passage like that. And you'll see how many there were that there weren't, in fact. There just aren't that many, even at that level. And we'll look at some of the others where the change in wording is a little interesting, but it's not significant. Doesn't really change the issue one way or the other. And we'll have a chance to see that. Okay. So next week, we're going to look at this a little bit more in terms of specifics. I'll show you some of these examples where we have a manuscript that did one of these things. It's very clear that this manuscript wrote this line twice. He skipped this line, these 3 lines between 2 lines. And when you look at the manuscript, they both started with the same 6 words and were only different on the last 3 words. Then he went back and got this one and skipped, and he thought, well, I've already written that. And so he went on below the second one, not below the first one. We'll see some of that. And then we'll look at the 3, the only 2 long passages, we've already mentioned the one in the New Testament, where there is any significant manuscript difference. And then the one little verse most contentious for absolutely no reason, because there's no question about the fact that it's an addition. We'll look at those, and then the next week we'll go through the text almost page by page, based on the footnotes of English translators where there's a difference and the translator notes it. So you can see what kind of meaningful differences have occurred, the frequency, and their ultimate importance. Okay? I almost got you out on time, didn't I?
Thank you, Brother Platt.
You are welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Platt, Brother Platt.
Yes.
Before I go, I don't know if you saw my email. This is Kenva. So I did make class tonight, even though I wasn't sure I would. But I have another question. I don't know if you saw an email that I wrote previous to that about the submission of the notebook. Are you
Yes.
okay? Because I'm taking handwritten notes for class. Are you okay with me taking pictures of my handwritten notes
Sure.
and submitting
Yeah.
those? And
Absolutely.
My main question is the handouts that we are receiving from you. Do I need to somehow compile those with my handwritten notes and submit them to you electronically by email, or are you okay with just receiving my handwritten notes, or how do you
No,
want me to
what
handle
I
that?
sent, what I sent you to fill out is all you need to worry about sending me.
Oh, okay, okay.
Okay?
So the questions that
Yeah.
we answer, my handwritten notes and any other things that
Yeah.
I find. Okay.
Yeah. And I'll
All right.
send you back copies of those with
Oh,
my
okay.
notes on them.
Okay. Thank
All
you.
right? You're
All right.
welcome.
All right. Bye-bye.
So we don't have
Bye-bye.
to submit, we don't have to submit our handwritten notes.
Pardon?
We don't have to submit handwritten notes, the notebook. Do we still have to submit the notebooks?
Yes, we still have to.
Okay.
I was just
Yeah.
asking because I'm a distance student and I'm not in class, and I want to know if
I'm
I
not
could
in
just.
class too.
And I wouldn't necessarily need to see your notebook if you aren't coming. Just shoot me a couple of pictures about what it looks like, how you give me a list of what kind of material you put in it.
Okay.
And it doesn't even have to be a notebook. I'm perfectly comfortable with somebody doing all this on their computer if they want to do it.
Okay. Thank you.
You're
Okay.
welcome.
And is there a time when you expect us to have it all finished? Are we gonna wait till the end of class, or?
Yeah, you can wait till the end of class.
Okay. All right.
All
Thank
right.
you. Good night, everyone.
Yeah,
Good night. Thank you.
thank you. 3, 4, 1, 2. This didn't print out right, but at least it printed. Last night I couldn't get it to print.
This is why I like so bad. I'm sitting here laughing because what came to my mind while ago was like, I said, well, I sound like full of things. What difference does it make? All this different, you're fighting over an in or a Z or something. I don't get it. It seems like to me, it's all about being saved in Jesus. I don't, but that's.
There's what I need. Here you go.
Thank you, son.
Yeah, we, in my opinion, involved.
Oh, here's another one.
Because I just don't, people use the Bible a lot of times, it's just, it's, their own interpretation and stuff, and they fight over it and all of that. Obviously, it shouldn't go on.
Here's that deal of the verbs.
Bible, and it's all about Jesus, and being your savior, that's a personal thing. And
And it says, don't add to and don't take away from, and we spent.
But they're doing the best they can, and they write it down, and then they're trying to tear it apart and dissect it like it was somebody's body or something. Oh, well.
That's the spend so much time on the jots and the tittles. And
Yeah, and if the different churches would just teach about Christ and not worry about their agenda and how one is different than the other. They shouldn't be that different. You either believe in Christ or you don't,
the word is the word.
The word is the word. And it doesn't matter if it has an A or an and or a B,
He says, don't add to it, don't take away from it. If I said it, no matter what your opinion is, you don't have one.
Ancient